Putin News Now. The death toll at area restaurants rose to 8 as officials declared that countdown to end of Putin had begun. Rescue workers are still searching the rubble of a shopping mall in the eastern Ukrainian city of Kramatorsk in frontline Oblast Donetsk for survivors after twin Russian missile attacks killed at least 8 people, including one child. Kramatorsk City Council said 42 more people who were eating at the mall restaurant were hurt. The missile attack twisted the metal beams of the major shopping center into a chaotic web. A village outside of Kramatorsk was also struck by one of the missiles, and its inhabitants were injured. Donetsk, a city in the frontline oblast, has been under constant Russian attack and is a top priority for Moscow. Exactly 1 year after a similar missile strike on a shopping mall killed at least 20, Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Russia of using S-300 missiles in the attack. Andriy Yermak, Mr. Zelensky's most trusted advisor, recently declared that the countdown has started until Mr. Putin becomes president. 2 Russian missiles hit a restaurant in the eastern Ukrainian city of Kramatorsk, killing at least 4 people, including a child, and leaving rescuers to search the rubble for survivors. The City Council of Kramatorsk reported that 42 additional diners were injured in the attack. Kramatorsk locals huddled together outside the damaged restaurant while emergency personnel rushed in and out. A warped tangle of metal beams was all that was left of the building. A man in uniform was carried out on a stretcher by police and soldiers. He was put in an ambulance, but it was unclear whether or not he would make it. Donetsk, a city in the frontline oblast, has been under constant Russian attack. A village outside of Kramatorsk was also struck by one of the missiles, and its inhabitants were injured. Because of the ongoing war in Ukraine and the recent tremor caused by a brief mutiny led by Wagner's Yevgeny Prigozhin, officials in Kyiv are speculating that Vladimir Putin's regime in Moscow will soon collapse. Andriy Yermak, an advisor to Volodymyr Zelensky, recently commented, "I think the countdown has started," in reference to the remaining years of Mr. Putin's presidency. At a press conference in Kyiv, Mr. Yermak said, "What Ukraine has seen since 2014 has become evident for the entire world." He continued, "This is a terrorist country whose leader is an incompetent person who has lost touch with reality. The rest of the world must come to the conclusion that serious relations with that country are impossible." Despite the fact that the rebellious mercenary soldiers who briefly took over a Russian military headquarters and were marching ominously toward Moscow were driven out over the weekend, Mr. Putin has been weakened as his forces face a fierce counter-offensive in Ukraine because of the incident. The former head of the British Armed Forces General Staff, Lord Richard Dannatt, has stated that Putin is much diminished and the Russian military, which has significant implications for Ukraine. Prigozhin has left the stage to go to Belarus, but is that the end of Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Wagner Group? Russia's deputy military commander in Ukraine, General Sergei Surovikin, was aware of mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin's plot to overthrow Moscow's defense officials. The New York Times cited anonymous U.S. officials who had been briefed on U.S. intelligence as saying they were trying to learn if General Sergei Surovikin, the former top Russian commander in Ukraine, helped plan Mr. Prigozhin's actions last weekend. The report continued by stating that there were indications that additional Russian generals may have supported Mr. Prigozhin. As Vladimir Putin lauded his military for preventing civil war, the Wagner leader flew into exile in Belarus yesterday following an agreement that put an end to a brief mutiny by his Wagner fighters over the weekend. Following the failed insurrection led by the Wagner Group, a notorious Russian mercenary army, the United States took action against companies suspected of doing business with the group. The decision is not thought to be related to the coup itself, but rather a reaction to Wagner's involvement in some of the bloodiest fighting in Ukraine since Russian forces launched a full-scale invasion there last year. The Treasury Department issued a statement criticizing African and Middle Eastern businesses for their role in a gold-selling scheme that circumvented U.S. sanctions in order to fund Wagner Group operations. Andrei Nikolaevich Ivanov, a Wagner executive, was also hit with personal sanctions related to his business dealings. Kyiv's defense minister, Oleksiy Reznikov, told the Financial Times that freeing some villages from Russian occupation in recent weeks was not the main event in the attack that was planned. "You will all be witnesses to it when it does occur." In an interview published today, he told FT that everyone will see everything, dismissing reports of slow progress against fortified Russian positions. According to Mr. Reznikov, the bulk of Ukraine's reserve forces have not yet been deployed. This includes most brigades that have received Western training and are equipped with modern NATO tanks and armored vehicles. Ukraine's emergency services reported today that 8 people had been killed as a result of Russia's attack on the city of Kramatorsk in the country's east. Officials reported 56 more casualties. Rescuers are working through the rubble of the destroyed building and searching for people who are probably still under it, officials from the emergency services said on the Telegram messaging app. The city of Kramatorsk was hit by 2 Russian missiles yesterday, one of which was aimed at a popular restaurant in the downtown area. 3 people were rescued from the wreckage, according to the emergency services. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of a mercenary group, armed a revolt against the Russian government and then walked free. Some others who dared to criticize the Kremlin were not so fortunate. Even though about a dozen Russian troops were killed in clashes, Russia's main domestic security agency, the FSB, announced on Tuesday that it had dropped the criminal investigation into last week's revolt. After reaching an agreement with Prigozhin, the Kremlin agreed not to prosecute him as long as he put an end to the uprising and fled to Belarus. Despite President Vladimir Putin's promises to punish the uprising's organizers, that resulted. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, was asked about this U-turn by the Associated Press on a conference call with reporters on Tuesday, and he declined to comment. The Kremlin's handling of anti-government protests like speaking out against the war in Ukraine or challenging Putin's rule stands in stark contrast to Prigozhin's apparent immunity from prosecution, at least for the time being. Russian forces tortured and summarily executed dozens of civilians who had been arrested in connection with Russia's attack on Ukraine, the UN Human Rights Office said on Tuesday. More than 900 cases of civilians, including children and the elderly, being arbitrarily detained in the conflict, the vast majority by Russia, were detailed in a report for which the global body interviewed hundreds of victims and witnesses. According to the head of the United Nations Human Rights Office in Ukraine, the vast majority of those interviewed reported being tortured and, in some cases, subjected to sexual violence while in detention by Russian forces. Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Russia of attacking a shopping mall in Kramatorsk, Donetsk, with S-300 surface-to-air missiles. The president of Ukraine announced in his evening address that Russian savages had fired missiles at the Kremenchuk district once again on the anniversary of the attack on the shopping mall in which 22 people had been killed. Moreover, he said, Russian terrorists have also been brutally shelling Kramatorsk today. Those pesky S-300s. A child was among the 3 fatalities. My deepest sympathies to the bereaved loved ones. Over 40 people have been hurt as of this hour. Everyone is receiving help right now. They are cleaning up the debris. Mr. Zelensky said, every such act of terror proves again and again to us and the whole world that Russia deserves only one thing as a result of everything it has done: defeat and a tribunal, fair and legal trials against all Russian murderers and terrorists. The Soviet Union is responsible for the development of the S-300 family of surface-to-air missiles. After a decade of research and development, it went into operation for the first time in the late 1970s. Military analysts have observed what they believe to be Russia's use of repurposed S-300 missiles to strike ground targets during the conflict in Ukraine. The S-300 missile system was designed to destroy incoming cruise and ballistic missiles as well as aircraft and drones. Yevgeny Prigozhin, leader of a mercenary group that fought the Russian government and won, was allowed to go free. Some others who dared to criticize the Kremlin were not so fortunate. Even though about a dozen Russian troops were killed in clashes, Russia's main domestic security agency, the FSB, announced on Tuesday that it had dropped the criminal investigation into last week's revolt. After reaching an agreement with Prigozhin, the Kremlin agreed not to prosecute him as long as he put an end to the uprising and fled to Belarus. Despite President Vladimir Putin's promises to punish the uprising's organizers, that resulted. The end of Putin's regime is imminent, according to Zelensky's advisor.